Our heralds too have been stricken with this malady. Okay, I'm sorry. This is Chris Carpenter. I am your instructor for English 2332 WorldLit 1 online. I know what you're thinking. There's nothing worse than an instructor who gets too much into it, but you'll have to fight through it because it's me. So anyway, I'm going to take my helmet off now so you can hear me, plus it's incredibly uncomfortable. Yes, so here I am. Welcome to you. You've already been in the class for a week, but we're trucking along with the Greek play Lysistrata by Aristophanes, the greatest comedian of classical Greece. And so what I want to do for the next few minutes is talk about the age of the Greek city-states, roughly between the 6th and 4th century BC, and how Aristophanes fits into that age historically. So first, what I want to do is briefly describe this glorious costume I'm wearing. I picked it up at Big Lots. They usually have them toward the front. So anyway, first we've got the Corinthian helmet. Now this is what you typically see in Greek warfare and on pottery and things like that. And by the way, if you looked at the Soldier of the Week document, you probably identify some of these things that I'm wearing. Well, so this is again, the Corinthian helmet, the distinctive style. You've got the kind of oval eyes, the plunging cheek pieces, horsehair crest. Not all helmets had crests. An outfit like this, as the Soldier of the Week document outlines, would have to be bought at great expense. So whoever wore something like this, something as fabulous as this, would have to have some money. But anyway, Greek soldiers were citizen soldiers. They were not conscripts. They were not drafted into an army. They volunteered to defend their homeland. And that's one reason they were so effective. And of course, I'm sitting in front of a highly historically accurate Greek landscape here with the Goodwill couch and the Target clock that the battery's been expired for about 6 months. Anyway, let's continue. So, Corinthian helmet. This is the cuirass. It is a linothorax. This one's made of leather. Normally they were made of linen, reinforced linen. Pretty good at deflecting blows, you'd be surprised. And then I've got greaves here to protect the shins. So at any rate, this is the armor, and this is cutting badly into my hand, so I'm going to put this down now. Very good. Okay, let's get back to the play, and actually before we talk about the play, we're going to talk about Greece. This isn't a history class, but we need to have some background. I've always thought it was pointless to talk about literature of any kind and the people that wrote it without giving some kind of historical framework. You can't do anything with it, you don't know what they were thinking. So let's talk for a bit about the era of the Greek city-state. Once again, we're talking about 6th century BC till about the 4th century BC. BC, remember the years count down, and then AD they go back up again up until 2013. BC basically means before Christ. AD doesn't mean after death, it means Anno Domini, year of our Lord. Well, anyway, this all happens BC, an era of about 200 years, when in Greece, which is the eastern end of the Mediterranean, if you don't know where it is, Google it right now, come back, I'll wait. Thank you. Look up Greece, and this is where everything happened that we're going to be talking about, and it's the background for the play. So Greek city-states were exactly what they sound like. Cities that were very powerful politically. If you asked someone living in classical Greece where they were from, they wouldn't say Greece. There was no identity of Greece or any concept of Greece. Instead, you lived in your city-state. There were hundreds of them, but the 5 biggies were Athens, that's where Aristophanes is from, Sparta, you know that from 300, a jacked up bearded guy going, Thebes, Argos, and Corinth. And so these city-states were the socio-political construct of their time. They were the nations of their time. Okay, so what we want to do is talk about what this era meant to Western civilization. It is accurately described as the cradle of Western civilization, classical Greece. Most of the traditions of the West came out of Greece. Mainly that's because the Greeks were fairly advanced in terms of codification, writing, legal thought, philosophy, literature, and military. That has a lot to do with how you're remembered. Even if we're opposed to war now, or most of us are, in the Greek period, war was simply a fact of life. You did not yearn for peace. It wasn't going to happen, so you didn't even try. So the sensibility of that time is completely different from our own. Greeks did not view the world as sometimes war, sometimes peace. They all were always happening at the same time. You couldn't have one without the other. And there's no Greek writer whose theme was not in some way war. And that includes Aristophanes with his bawdy comedies. They still had to do with war. Lysistrata, the women get together and decide no more of this and that so that the war will end. Okay, so what we want to do is talk a little bit about Aristophanes and his role in Greek comedy. Now, I know that when you read this play, or if you still have to read it, you may read the description of comedy, and it may not strike you individually as funny. But the reason we call it a comedy is because of the way in which it pursues its main point. And there's no doubt that Aristophanes' works were absurd, they were silly, and they were meant to be funny to audiences of that time. If you looked at the PowerPoint, you know the difference between old and new comedy, and Lysistrata is really kind of on the edge of those two, but it's mostly old comedy. And the other thing is, when you think of ancient Greece, you may think of some very noble guy in a robe orating to a crowd, kind of hoity-toity. Aristophanes, that is not his scene. He's, again, very bawdy, a lot of bad language, a lot of adult situations, you know what I'm saying? I mean, think about the main plot of this play. So don't lump him in with Socrates, who, of course, he hated and who he had a lot to do with discrediting. Think of him as more common entertainment, or entertainment, I guess, more for the masses. All right, let's talk for a second about the social or the cultural framework of this time. Greek religion. Now, many of you may have read some Greek mythology, many of you may have not. But Greek gods were, of course, different from gods of current religions. I mean, if you think about the big few religions today, most of them have gods that are infallible. They are perfect. In fact, they are superhuman. Well, Greek gods were far different. They had human characteristics, including flaws. They could be wrong. They could do terrible things to one another and to humans. In fact, the gods really represented human characteristics. And I think that's one of the reasons that 3,000 years later, Greek mythology is still pretty popular. There's a reason it's still taught. The actions of the gods were meant to echo the actions of humans, even the flaws. And current religions are very caught up in the idea of justice. There's something that's good, something that's bad, and the thing that's bad must be punished. In Greek mythology, there's some rules you shouldn't break, and sometimes people break them and get punished, but not always. Sometimes the gods get away with evil things just like people do. So again, Greek mythology and religion, and by the way, Greek religion is what we call polytheistic, not monotheistic. Monotheistic means one deity, one God, not for the Greeks and the Romans after them. Polytheistic, meaning several different gods, not just one. But as you can tell from my rambling, the whole emphasis is different. It's not on justice, and the gods aren't perfect. And we exist at their whim, and they may be wrong about things. They may pull cruel hoaxes on us and pranks. So, and finally, Greek gods fought. Once again, warfare indivisible with anything else in the Greek world and Greek culture. You must have warfare. It's simply part of the course of staying alive, ironically. So there's no way to get away from war in any aspect of Greek life. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about Athens. Now, Athens is the city-state that Aristophanes hails from. And Athens, as you know from the PowerPoint, was a threat to other Greek city-states. Not only because it was very wealthy, it did a lot of trading. It was, this is sort of a flimsy analogy, but it was sort of like the United States of ancient Greece in the sense that very much mercantile, a lot of trading, very wealthy. It had an extremely powerful navy. Now, Sparta, to the south, had a very powerful army. But culturally, and let me tell you something, this is kind of a little rant of mine, but after 300 came out, everybody was all, Sparta's great, Sparta's awesome. Let me tell you something, Sparta did have a great army. But outside of that, Sparta had a big old bag of nothing as far as culture, literature, intellectual thought, philosophy, It's all Athens that completely dominates that that aspect of Greek life. Well, anyway, back we go to Athens. So Athens is a threat. One reason they're a threat, aside from their money, is their ideology or their system of rule. It is a democracy. It's not the kind of democracy we think of today, but there are similarities. Now, democracy is based on Greek words meaning people power. And so Athens had an assembly that was made up of all of the men who had undergone 2 years of military training. Now remember, there is no standing army in ancient Greece, and in Athens, of course. What this means is, generally you're a citizen, or maybe you're a farmer who lives just outside of the city walls. You have some money, but the idea is if you're being threatened by another city-state, you volunteer for military service, and you receive training a few times a year. And so if somebody gets near your city, you guys band together, you train, you buy your own equipment like this, you fight, hopefully you win. But the idea is that Greek soldiers were volunteers, and that's one reason that they tended to be very successful in warfare, because their motivation was much higher than recruited or levied soldiers. Well, back we go to Athenian democracy. So the people who could vote were every male who had had a couple of years of military service. That's about 20% of the population. So if you ask most people today, is that a democracy? Most people would say, no, that's a pretty small percentage. But at the time, I mean, there was no other city-state that operated that way. Or if they did, it was because Athens pushed it onto them. So Athens was expanding economically and politically, and it was exporting this idea of democracy. Well, other city-states, especially Sparta, didn't like that at all, because democracy naturally threatened their own systems, which either were monarchies where a king would rule, or a small oligarchy, a group of very influential, wealthy men, a small group that would make all the decisions. Obviously, a democracy threatens that. So as Athens gets more powerful, Sparta gets more and more alarmed. And so I'll talk a little bit about that Athenian assembly, the assembly in Athens where you would have all of the eligible voters meet. Usually it met once a month, sometimes 3 a month. You're talking between 6 and 20,000 people every month. And that seems like it would never ever work, but surprisingly it did, and most of the meetings were fairly calm or orderly. Now, obviously it was very important at that time, if you wanted to have influence in the assembly, to be able to speak well, to be a good orator, and that's why the tradition of Greek oration and Greek rhetoric has established itself so firmly in the Western tradition, because it was so inextricably linked with democracy, and it is today. We still view someone who speaks well and who has a coherent mindset as someone who's ideal to lead or to be elected. Okay, so in Athens, this system of democracy worked fairly well. There were some drawbacks, of course, but it did mean that leaders were accountable. Leaders couldn't simply act on a whim and no one would call them out. Because the leaders were elected and they were held to task by the people who had elected them, or at least that 20%, it meant that decisions were made by consensus. It didn't mean they were always right or that they were always good, but certainly they were more popular. And that meant that Athenians fought, in some respects, Athenians fought harder than the citizens of other city-states. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this, and then we'll move on to Aristophanes himself. Now, we say that Athens was a democracy, but again, as we've said, it's not like we think of it now. And Athenians had slaves. In fact, maybe half of the population was indeed made up of slaves. But it's not, look, I would never argue that at any time being a slave was a good deal. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about the American South or ancient Greece. But being a slave in classical Greece, not the same as being a slave in the American South. You're not usually treated like an animal in ancient Greece. I mean, certainly you are owned by someone. You can't vote. Slaves couldn't vote. But you had an important role in the day-to-day functioning of the city, and you also belonged there. You weren't like an animal who was brought in to entertain people or to take care of the stuff they didn't want to do. So you were held in a little higher esteem than slaves in other societies might have been. Once again, still not a good deal. But what I'm trying to say is that even though Athens wasn't a true democracy the way that we think of it now, it was still a very radical society for its time, a very unusual society. And again, you can see why it was such a threat to other city-states, especially Sparta. Okay, what we want to do is talk for a second now about the Peloponnesian War. If you look through the PowerPoint, this rings a bell. And the Peloponnesian War is the war that's the backdrop of Lysistrata. The Peloponnesian War is essentially a conflict between Athens and Sparta. It lasts about 30 years. It's incredibly bloody. It's full of blunders on both sides. Carnage without any really good reason. And really the reason that the whole war takes place is, again, because Sparta feels threatened. Sparta started it. I mean, Sparta really did start the war. And Athens, which had naval dominance as opposed to Sparta's ground dominance with its soldiers, began a campaign that would eventually, they attempted to defend their city from the Spartan invasion, and that led to several different stages of the war. And we're not going to go through all these stages because, you know, there's entire courses taught on this war. But what I want to say is right in about the middle of this 30-year period, very roughly, is when Aristophanes writes Lysistrata. And the idea is Athens is getting tired of the war. Not only because there's death of their men, they don't like that, but there's starvation, there's problem with the crops, and a plague has broken out that has killed about 80,000 Athenian citizens. The population of Athens at this time, of course they don't know, but they figure it might have been somewhere between 1 and 200,000 people, which was a huge, huge city for the time. So, at any rate, Athens is tired of the war, and in Aristophanes' play, the women, or at least Lysistrata, she has decided it's time for this to end for a number of reasons, and you can talk about those on the discussion boards. The play delineates those reasons. But anyway, she's decided this is it, enough is enough. So the Peloponnesian War is the war that Aristophanes is writing about. And right about the time he is writing the play, it was first performed, by the way, in Athens in 411 BC. So it's pretty crazy to think that this play was aired in a society where this war was still raging, and it was obviously very, very critical of the conduct of the war and the thought process behind the war. And only in a society like Athens could something like that happen. I mean, if you had tried to stage this play in Sparta, well, first of all, I don't think the Spartans cared at all about theater, but even if you had tried to stage this play, you can imagine, I mean, you'd be pretty much toast as soon as anybody saw it. But in Athens, where there's this democratic tradition where it's okay to call out the leadership, this play is aired. So at the time this play is written, the war is not going terribly well for Athens. And by the way, eventually Sparta will win that war. Now, Athens gets the last laugh because Sparta's alliance falls apart shortly after the war ends, and the Athenians get the upper hand again in commerce and on the waves and the naval power. But the Peloponnesian War, for the 18th time, is the backdrop to the play. Okay, so what we want to do is talk for just a minute, and then we're going to end this brilliant video, talking about Aristophanes himself. So you know again from the PowerPoint that he writes what's called Old Comedy, which is very satirical, and it is aimed at individual characters, individual figures, sometimes very powerful figures in Athenian society. And it was not unusual in one of Aristophanes' plays, or any play written in the style of Old Comedy, for individual members of the audience to be mocked. So the actors might wear masks of a certain politician and make these incredibly outrageous statements to make the politician look incredibly stupid. And, I mean, you might pay for it in one way or another, but generally speaking, it was okay to do that, which again makes the Athenian experience somewhat remarkable. Well, okay, back to Aristophanes. So even though he's writing this play and he's critical of the conduct of the war, Aristophanes himself is something of a conservative in the sense that he believes that Athenians of the past, and I mean past as in before him, before his generation, were stronger. They were more moral. They were more noble. They weren't corrupted by licentious ideals and obsession with pleasure and things like that. He believes that that change, that the younger generation coming up has ruined everything. That's why the Athenians are losing the war. So that's a debate that is on the discussion board as well that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. Many people view Lysistrata as sort of a feminist play, or not sort of, but a feminist play where women take advantage of a situation. They're able to assert their power. They find a new identity where they matter and can actually influence events in a situation where they've never been able to do so before. Obviously, women did not have the right to vote in Athens. But, so some people view the play that way. Others say, well, it's not so much feminist as he is criticizing the really lame generation of men that's now controlling things. I'm interested to see what you think about that. That's an open question. Well, at any rate, okay, so Aristophanes is actually something of a conservative, and that's one reason why he clashes with Socrates, the great philosopher, who's also an Athenian. Socrates, concentrating on reason and concentrating on logic, actually gets people to think that maybe our existence isn't completely in the hands of the gods, that maybe the decisions we make control our fate more than we've thought in the past. Aristophanes doesn't like this. He believes that's not only sort of blasphemous to the gods, but it's also very arrogant, he thinks. And so he leads this campaign, or I shouldn't say he leads, but he's part of a campaign to discredit Socrates, and indeed that does eventually lead to Socrates being tried for corruption of morals, and in the end Socrates is forced to commit suicide. Okay, so that is classical Greece, that is Athens, or at least Athenian democracy, that is the Peloponnesian War. So hopefully this information is of some use to you, and I thank you very much for your, well, I hope you've been paying attention. Maybe you've been, have another screen open this whole time and are busy killing angry birds or whatever it is people do. But I thank you. This is the first time that I've taught this course online. And so a lot of these videos, yeah, I know the quality is going to be pretty rotten for a while, but I'll get better at it as the semester goes on. Hopefully these will be a little more entertaining. So, last thing I will say, honestly, I've said that 10 times now, the last thing I will say is, what eventually happens to classical Greece? How does it end, so to speak? Well, obviously it doesn't end, but what happens is, in the 4th century BC, at the beginning of this, we said this period is roughly from the 6th to the 4th century BC. Well, in the 4th century BC, Macedonia, which is a country to the north of Greece, invades. And they actually succeed in overcoming resistance. A lot of it has to do with the Greeks not liking each other and not being able to unite. But Macedonia takes over Greece. I'm simplifying things greatly, but essentially it's under the leadership of Alexander the Great. He's a Macedonian. And Alexander the Great, after solidifying his control in Greece, is going to go on to invade Persia and much of the known world. You've probably heard of him. So that happens in the 4th century BC. Okay, well, that's it. So thanks again for your time. Do email me if you have questions. And have a good night, morning, whatever it is you're experiencing. Thank you.